community in the country to be made an official language as well, turning back a situation where since 1956, effectively for 30 years, Sinhala, the language of the majority community, was the only official language of the country. Now, the 13th Amendment, the provincial council system that came forward, was one that passed the Supreme Court of Sri Lanka by a whisker on the basis that it did not in any way violate the unitary status of the state. The Constitution of Sri Lanka, Article 2, says that Sri Lanka will be a unitary state. And so any form of devolution has to ensure that the unitary state is untouched. So what that means, therefore, is that the system of devolution has the powers granted to the provinces are really, at the end of the day, it's heavily weighted in favor of the center. Financial powers in particular are with the center to the extent that the provinces can effectively be paralyzed by the non-cooperation of the center. In addition to that, you have a provincial list, a reserve list, and what you call a concurrent list with a jurisdiction exercised by both center and provinces. But that invariably means that the center trumps the province when it comes to a glitch. And the Supreme Court, as the ultimate arbiter of the Constitution, does it from the perspective of Sri Lanka is a unitary state. So at the end of the day, the center is favored. Now, since 1988, we've had this system. Since 2006, we've had it also in the East as a separate province. 2008 in the East as a separate province. We don't have a provincial council in the North. There are two areas where there is considerable controversy with regard to it, and that is with regard to land powers and police powers. These powers are there in the 13th Amendment to be given to the provinces, but they have never ever been devolved to the provinces in any part of the country whatsoever. The government is absolutely adamant that these powers are not going to be devolved to the provinces at all. The real demand with regard to these powers to be devolved is from the North and East in particular. And the government says, no, that will not be the case. But for some time, and this is the farcical dimension of the whole thing, for some time we've had a mock debate, and I call it a mock debate again deliberately, saying, there is going to be a political solution to this conflict. Is it going to be 13th Amendment plus? The government has sort of let out that it will be something beyond the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. Now, we had an all-party representatives committee that met over a year and a half. It did produce a final report which hasn't really seen the light of day, but it did commission panels of experts to give ideas on what the solution should be. There was a majority report of a panel of experts which went well beyond the 13th Amendment to arguing for, in effect, a quasi-federal constitution for the country. But the government decided that it was not going to have a look at it. Now, as a consequence of international pressure, and Indian pressure in particular, we've gone through this exercise of continuing to talk. And in January of this year, the government sat down for direct talks with the Tamil National Alliance, the chief political party representing the Tamils, to discuss two things. One, return, rehabilitation of the IDPs, internally displaced persons, and two, a political settlement. With regard to the first, there was one sticking point in that the Tamil representatives were asked by their constituency to get a list from the government of all detainees and as to where they have been detained. Fathers, brothers, mothers, sisters. On 3 separate occasions, the government said that they would give this list. And indeed, MPs plus ordinary civilians went to government offices to get the list, did not get lists at all. In March, the TNA submitted its own proposals to the government of Sri Lanka with regard to a political settlement. No response from them until August. Then the TNA turned up and said, look, we give you 10 days, please respond to this, or there's no point in having these talks. The government then accused the TNA of behaving like the LTTE and arbitrarily imposing deadlines. Indian and American pressure prevailed on the TNA to say, look, we will come back to the table. There's been one round of talks since. In the meantime, again, the government has announced that there will be a parliamentary select committee which will look at this. So, I mean, what we're getting here, it's a long and tedious story. What we're getting here is each time there's a kind of hiatus in international pressure, the government comes up with a committee. And we all know these committees are absolute farce because they can sit forever and forever, and the government will always tell its critics, look, you can't prejudge what this committee is going to do. It's almost like a kind of sub judice argument. Don't talk about it. These guys are sitting and discussing it. But we know it is prevarication, procrastination amounting to prevarication, and quite outright deceit, quite frankly. So I don't think, in answer to that question, I think the government of the day that we have in Sri Lanka believes in its heart of hearts that the status quo should apply, should obtain, and that the end of the conflict is also the end of the war, and that is the military defeat of the LTTE is end of story. There is a missing gene in its political makeup to understand what the conflict is all about, because the trajectory of everything that it has done subsequent to the end of the war indicates that reconciliation is not something that it is particularly interested in. Yeah. Unfortunately, we have an extremely divided opposition that cannot resolve its internal differences, but are obsessed with its internal differences. At the same time, I think what's happened is that the president and the ruling coalition has very successfully and skillfully capitalized on the feeling that opposition MPs have that, my God, for the next 5-10 years, I'll be in opposition, there's no point in me being in politics. Because unfortunately, the culture of politics is one of dispensing largesse and patronage, and they feel that there's no point in being in opposition. So we have situations in which subsequent to the election in 2010, MPs and wholesale parties have crossed over to the government precisely because they balk at the prospect of being in opposition for too long a time. But at the end of the day, I suppose we still do have a residual two-party system. And if there is something that goes wrong for the government, the opposition will automatically benefit, and not least because the members of the ruling coalition, and I suppose this is not at all surprising, the moment the brothers are metaphorically bleeding in the water, they'll pounce on him like piranhas. Because they too know that the power structure is completely stuck at its apex. If you're not part of the family, you're in effect second class.
Just the question on political settlement that Professor Harris raised. What would a political settlement be viable look like? Yeah.
I mean, I think there is no, in my opinion, no escaping from the simple fact that a political settlement has to go beyond the unitary state. I personally would argue for a federal constitution for Sri Lanka, but leaving aside the sort of nomenclature, it has to be very clearly deep and meaningful devolution of power to the provinces, where there's a degree of autonomy, where you will have one Bill of Rights, one army, one Supreme Court, all of that, but there will be considerable autonomy for the provinces to get on with their own thing. I think you can bridge the democratic deficit, not just in ethnic terms, but in general. And also one other thing, the Tamil diaspora funded the LTT to the tune of millions of dollars over a long period of time. Every time I speak to any of them now, they turn around and say, we want to do X, Y, and Z, but we're not going to give the money to the central government of Sri Lanka because it'll never get to the north and east. We want to know that there is a mechanism there through which this money can be funneled.
You've got Project Chatterjee.
Okay, some quick comments. I agree. I think Chatterjee's overstates the distinction between civil society and political society. I'd much prefer to interpret them as different political styles rather than as clearly demarcated domains. Yes, in the context he's writing about, he's talking about people who lack basic rights of citizenship. I think in Thailand I'm talking about people who have much more established rights, land rights, citizenship rights, electoral rights. I think their marginalisation in Thailand is much more sort of political, cultural, ideological. So I think there's some significant difference there in the way I'm using the concept in Thailand to his writing about India. Just on the broader point, you found my conclusions pessimistic. Well, perhaps I've been misunderstood because I'm very optimistic. I have great optimism for this political society in Thailand. I find this collaborative relationship that develops at local levels between peasants, middle-income peasants and state officials, productive of all sorts of things that are lacking in the local economy in Thailand. It's not something that will exist forever, but I think it's quite a productive, constructive response to some of the middle-income challenges that rural Thailand faces at the moment. So I'm not pessimistic about it. Perhaps I should be even more explicit. I don't really think vote buying's a problem in Thailand. I don't think it's a problem. I think if you're, and I know you don't either, but just in relation to some of the other questions, I think if you're, what I call a middle-income peasant in Thailand who now is earning income, way beyond dreams of a generation ago, when your kids quite literally never go to bed hungry, which they did 20 or 30 years ago, when you have universal education, pretty good health care, all these things, and then if some politicians want to come along every few years and give you 500 baht, then good luck to them. I don't think this is a serious problem for Thailand. Why hasn't the army addressed it? This electoral corruption? It's a fair question because the Thai army has proven much more effective acting against its own people than against any foreign enemy. So perhaps you could wonder why the Thai army hasn't addressed this. They're not very good at wars. I think they haven't addressed it because it's so convenient to have this image, this bogeyman of electoral corruption, because this consistently provides the army with their rationale for intervention in the political process. After the coup, when the military government organised the first election in 2007 after the coup, there was a bit of controversy because they said they didn't want international observers to come and watch the election. People were saying, oh, they're going to rig the election will be rigged. That's why they didn't have the international observers. My view was quite the opposite. They didn't want to have international observers there because the observers would observe that the election was relatively free and fair. And then that would take away the rationale that the military and the royalist elite in Thailand consistently uses to overturn elections. So they have a vested interest in maintaining this reputation of a corrupt electoral system. They don't want to destroy that.
Yeah, Dr. Chaudhry's question about the re-emergence, so to say, of Imran Khan. I think the important point is I think there is a space for this kind of a movement now, and this is not just the case in South Asia. Even in places like Germany, you've had there was a party, I think, which stood on the grounds of internet freedom, I think, which ended up sort of winning seats. So in the South Asian context, Imran Khan, of course, his party, Tehreek Khan, has been around now, as you yourself mentioned, for 20 odd years. But I think this is the kind of moment where there is such a sort of disgust with conventional politics, that there is a movement of people towards figures who are sort of seen as in some ways outside the system, personally honest, and that gives them a certain cachet. And that is the sort of similar kind of cachet that someone like Anna Hazare probably has. But in regard specifically to Anna Hazare himself and his team members, they've kept insisting that they don't want to get into electoral politics in the conventional sense. They will only campaign against what they say they are at the moment campaigning against the corruption because against the Congress, because they believe that the Congress is not serious about a strong Lokpur or an ombudsman. So their rhetoric is that if it was the BJP, they would campaign against the BJP on similar grounds. So, so I think Anna Hazare, if you sort of take their statements at face value, I don't think they are right now interested in some sort of a political formation, despite the figures that I showed. Of course, the caveat is this, the sample survey for these kind of surveys are very small, urban-based, so you can't really sort of generalize for a country as big as India.
We've got about 5 minutes left, and we've got two questions. The young woman here, and then the gentleman behind her.
I wanted to ask, we're looking at democracy in South Asia, and we're noticing that corruption is rampant. We're looking at 3 different countries and different levels of democracy and different levels of corruption in each. So I want to ask, what is the future of democracy, and is it or is it not becoming a barrier to development? And I'm not looking at development as economic development, because as it was established, that's not the only definition of development. I'm looking at an organic process where we're having development from a people perspective. So what is the future of democracy in South Asia, and is it or is it not helping development?
Thank you. And
my question sort of takes from her point, and I'm a law student. So my question is basically that the Asian countries, as opposed to the Western liberal idea of democracy, in the West we saw more liberal evolution of, organic evolution of democracy over a couple of centuries or so. But given the way it was, introduced to South Asia and Southeast Asia, and the sort of prioritization we see of economic development over democratic institutions and the rule of law itself, are we looking at a newer form of democracy or a new level of normalcy for democracy itself? And also drawing from Dr. Walker's point about citizens being okay with doing a trade-off for economic prosperity with respect to their personal rights. So are we looking at a newer form of democracy? And in that case, should we be looking at making structural changes to this, to recognizing a sort of democracy that in fact looks at more participation in economic life as opposed to the sort of mechanisms that exist today?
Well, in answer to the question, is democracy a barrier to development? I think my answer would be this. And, democracy has also very sordid kind of beginnings, and it goes through a whole variety of processes. It's not some sort of panacea which is totally clean and all of that. So one has to bear, in Sri Lanka, for example, we are talking about a democracy that in effect dates from 1931. So we are talking about, 70, 80 years of democracy. And I'd just like to remind you, after sort of 80 years after the first Reform Act, Electoral Reform Act in Britain, I think Lloyd George was selling peerages. So that whole question of the degree of corruption is not something that one should not sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater. The issue at the end of the day, I think, is this, does democracy provide you with institutions that are recognized, institutions and processes that are at least formally recognized as being legitimate by the entire population, or as many of the sectors in the population as such? It's never going to be perfect, but is there going to be a degree of accountability? Is there space for the pressure for transparency? Is there access, sufficient room for people to get in and be part of the decision-making body? And we do have, back at home, in terms of examples of where people are also quite immune to the layer of corruption and graft. In July of this year, we had local government elections in the north of the country. The ruling party first started off with violence and malpractice, and then stick went to carrot. The president and 10-odd ministers went there and spent 2 weeks and offered everything and the kitchen sink. The people listened to all of it and voted overwhelmingly against them. So, you have a process which allows a certain freedom of choice, freedom to do whatever. And so I don't think we should sort of, despair with regard to it. it is, I think, at the end of the day, the argument about not the most perfect system of government, but the one I think that in the end works over a longer period of time to the satisfaction of most.
So a Thai perspective on that in about 30 seconds?
30 seconds. Look, only one key point I can make. I don't want to get too relativist, but I don't find the idea of the concept of political corruption particularly analytically useful. You know, as we saw this morning, there's all sorts of ways politicians embed themselves in local networks of exchange. And I don't think we should be too quick to judge some of them as non-corrupt and some of them as corrupt. And I think to the extent that we have different styles of democracy developing in Asia, it's perhaps based on the way different sorts of relationships are being negotiated between the state and communities. And I think provided people have their ability to exercise a judgment about the nature of those relationships, then we can call that a democratic system.
Ranajoy, last word from India?
Very briefly. Democracy is messy in India as elsewhere. But I think the one reason for optimism is that movements or moments like Anna Hazare's the agitation do bring about sort of incremental changes. So what we now have, earlier the Indian Parliament passed a law where MPs had to declare their assets. Now I think there's a move to sort of bar anyone who's been charged with a criminal case from contesting. So I think there are these small sort of things which are on the margins that keep happening, and over time it's messy, but I think pressure often works. So that's the cause of optimism.
Thank you. And ladies and gentlemen, we have our ceremonial ending. It's a little bit like changing the guard at Buckingham Palace ISAS seminars. Some ceremonies have to be gone through at the end, and I'll pass it to Pradima to preside over those.
Thanks, Prof. I would like to invite Professor Jeffrey to present tokens of appreciation to the panel of speakers, please.
Professor Walker has suggested that his present will come in the form of cash, and that's what this large box is.
Dr. Saravanamuttu. Dr. Walker, and Dr. Sen. Once again, I thank the speakers for their insightful sharing. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of day one of the 7th International Conference on South Asia. On behalf of ISAS, I thank you for your participation and support. Please take some time out to complete the evaluation form and pass it to any ISAS staff at the registration table. We would now like to invite everyone to a tea reception at the foyer just outside the ballroom. Have a lovely evening ahead, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow for the special panel discussion and the third and final plenary session. Thank you.